before any dividends are paid to common shareholders. Sometimes they also have liquidation preferences.
So if you're analyzing a company's finances or a legal problem involving distributions.
You absolutely need to keep close track of where that money is going when preferred stock is involved. Those preferences can dramatically shift who gets what, especially if funds are limited. It's a key detail.
Who actually decides how much stock can be issued, what kind, common versus preferred, and who gets it? Does that come from the shareholders or somewhere else?
The authority to issue stock generally rests with the corporation's board of directors. Now, sometimes the articles of incorporation can actually grant this authority to the shareholders instead, but the board is the default and by far the most common decision maker here. The board also has the power to issue things like rights, options, and warrants. These are basically contracts that allow individuals to buy the corporation's stock in the future, often at a predetermined price. These are often used as tools to incentivize employees or attract future investors.
What can a corporation accept as payment, as consideration for its stock? Is it just cold, hard cash, or can it be other things too?
It's actually quite broad, which sometimes surprises people. Corporations can certainly accept money, but they can also accept tangible property, like a building, land, or equipment contributed to the company. They can accept intangible property, like valuable intellectual property, patents, or trademarks. And importantly, they can even accept services already rendered to the corporation. Maybe someone provided consulting work before the stock was issued.
And who decides if what's being offered is worth the stock price?
That's typically the board again. The critical point here is that as long as the board of directors, acting in its good faith business judgment, determines that the consideration received is adequate value for the stock is generally deemed fully paid and non-assessable. This means it's generally not subject to later challenge regarding its value, assuming the board wasn't acting fraudulently or completely unreasonably. This gives the board significant discretion.
What about those initial promises to buy stock, maybe made before the company was even officially formed? We talked about promoters making contracts. Is a promise to buy shares also binding from the get-go?
That brings us to pre-incorporation subscriptions. These are essentially agreements made by individuals or entities to purchase stock once the corporation actually comes into existence. What's crucial here, especially for the stability and predictability needed by a new venture trying to secure funding, is that these pre-incorporation subscriptions are generally irrevocable for 6 months from the date the subscription agreement is made.
Irrevocable for 6 months, so you can't just back out easily.
Not easily, no. Not unless all the other subscribers agree to let you revoke it, or the agreement itself provides otherwise. This provides a vital level of certainty for the nascent corporation trying to lock down that initial foundational funding. It prevents people from making commitments and then just walking away if things look slightly less rosy later.
Makes sense. Now, what if existing shareholders are worried about their ownership percentage getting diluted when the company decides to issue new shares later on to raise more capital? Do they have a right to buy some of those new shares first to maintain their stake?
That specific right is called a preemptive right. These rights allow existing shareholders to purchase newly issued shares of stock, often in proportion to their current holdings, enabling them to maintain their proportional ownership interest in the company. It's essentially a right of first refusal on new stock issuances, specifically designed to prevent dilution of their ownership percentage.
Are those automatic? Do all shareholders have them?
No, and this is a key point. Preemptive rights are not automatic. They exist only if the articles of incorporation expressly provide for them. If the articles are silent on the matter, then shareholders generally do not have preemptive rights. And if a shareholder has these rights but decides to waive them in writing, that waiver is typically irrevocable. So it's a significant right, but only if it's explicitly granted in the company's foundational document.
Okay, so we've set up the foundational ownership structure with stock, subscriptions, maybe preemptive rights, but what happens when the company actually starts making money? How does it share that wealth, that success with its owners, the shareholders?
Right, this is where corporate distributions come into play. The most common form, the one everyone thinks about, is cash dividend payments. The authority to declare and make these distributions rests squarely with the board of directors. It's a key way the corporation provides a return on investment to its shareholders, rewarding them for putting their capital at risk.
Seems straightforward enough, but are there any absolute limits on how much a corporation can distribute or when it can pay out dividends? I can imagine situations where a board might want to pay out huge dividends even if the company isn't doing well, maybe to appease shareholders, but that sounds risky for the business itself.
You've hit on a critical point, and yes, there are strict limitations. These limitations primarily serve as a crucial protection for the company's creditors. A corporation cannot legally make a distribution if it is insolvent, meaning it can't pay its debts as they come due in the usual course of business.
Okay, the insolvency test.
Right. Or, even if it can pay its debts today, it cannot make a distribution if the distribution itself would render the corporation insolvent. This might involve looking at whether the company's assets would still exceed its liabilities after the payout. These rules are designed to prevent the corporation from essentially emptying its coffers to shareholders, leaving nothing for its legitimate creditors who have claims against the company. It prioritizes the company's financial health and its obligations to outsiders over payouts to owners.
That makes sense. And what if a director ignores those rules? Maybe they're pressured by major shareholders, or maybe they're just negligent and they vote to approve an unlawful distribution, one that violates those solvency rules. Are they personally on the hook for that decision?
Yes, that's a serious potential consequence for directors. A director who votes for or agrees to an unlawful distribution, meaning one that violates those solvency rules we just discussed, is personally liable to the corporation for the amount of the distribution that exceeded what could have been lawfully paid.
Personally liable to the corporation.
Yes, typically to the corporation itself, allowing the corporation, or perhaps a trustee in bankruptcy, or even through a derivative suit, to recover the improper payment. This is considered a breach of their fiduciary duties, specifically their duty of care for not being diligent about the company's financial status, and potentially their duty of loyalty if they benefited personally or acted in bad faith. It's a direct potential financial consequence for bad judgment or negligence in handling corporate funds.
Okay, that's a strong deterrent. Now, flip side, what if a shareholder believes the company is flush with cash, has plenty of legally available funds according to those solvency tests, but the board just stubbornly refuses to pay out any dividends? Perhaps they're hoarding cash or maybe reinvesting it in projects the shareholder thinks are wasteful. Can a shareholder actually force the company to pay a dividend?
That's a classic scenario, and while shareholders do have a primary and personal right to compel a dividend, they can bring a direct action against the corporation for this. It is exceptionally difficult to win. It's a very, very high bar to clear.
Why is it so hard?
To prevail, the shareholder has to prove two very specific things, and the second one is the real challenge. First, they must show that funds to pay a dividend were indeed legally available, meaning the corporation wasn't insolvent or near insolvency, and the distribution rules wouldn't be violated. That's often the easier part.
Okay, and the second part?
Second, and this is crucial, they must prove that the directors acted in bad faith in refusing to pay the dividend. Merely disagreeing with the board's business judgment on how to best use the company's funds, like choosing to reinvest profits in growth instead of distributing them, is absolutely not enough. The shareholder has to prove something much more egregious, like the refusal was motivated by malice towards a particular shareholder, or it was part of an oppressive scheme against minority shareholders, or there was some clear conflict of interest or fraud involved. Courts give huge deference to the board's business judgment on dividend policy. And this really highlights the delicate balance directors have to strike, doesn't it? They have fiduciary duties to the corporation itself, which includes protecting its solvency, ensuring its long-term health, planning for future needs. But they also face expectations from shareholders who, quite reasonably, want a return on their investment. It raises an important question then. How do these financial decisions, these ownership stakes, actually play out in the market? Especially when shares are being actively bought and sold, sometimes involving, well, less than honest dealings.
Right. So once shares are issued and maybe dividends are flowing or maybe not, those shares start to change hands. People buy, people sell. Are shareholders generally free to sell their stock whenever and to whomever they wish, or are there limitations on that freedom?
For the most part, yes, the general principle is free transferability. Shareholders are usually free to sell their stock on the open market if it's publicly traded, or privately if it's not, as they wish. However, that freedom can indeed be restricted in specific circumstances. These restrictions can come from private agreements, especially in smaller companies, or from federal securities laws aimed at preventing fraud or insider trading.
Let's talk about those private restrictions first. What kind are we talking about? Like, can a small company absolutely prevent me from selling my shares to just anyone if I decide I want out?
These private restrictions on sale are most typically found in closely held corporations. Remember, those are companies with only a few shareholders, often family members or partners, and whose stock isn't traded on a public exchange. For such a restriction to be legally enforceable against a particular shareholder trying to sell, one of two conditions usually must be met. Either the person against whom enforcement is sought must have had actual knowledge of the restriction when they acquired the shares, or R, if the stock is represented by a physical certificate, the restriction must be conspicuously noted right there on the security certificate itself. It has to be obvious.
And are any kind of restrictions allowed? Could they say I can never sell?
No, not usually. Stock transfer restrictions are also subject to a test of reasonableness. Courts generally won't enforce restrictions that constitute an unreasonable restraint on alienation, the ability to sell your property. So, a restriction saying you can never sell your shares or only sell them back to the company for a ridiculously low price would likely be deemed unreasonable and unenforceable. But more common restrictions, like a right of first refusal, giving the corporation or the other shareholders the option to buy the shares first at a fair price before they're offered to an outsider, are usually considered reasonable and are quite common in closely held companies to maintain control.
Okay, that covers private limits. What about when a sale goes wrong on a bigger scale, maybe involving fraud, deception, or someone using inside information for an unfair advantage? Are there federal laws that step in then, even if it's not necessarily a publicly traded company?
Yes, definitely. Federal securities laws provide powerful tools to combat fraud and unfair trading practices. The two main federal causes of action we should focus on here are designed to ensure fairness and transparency in the securities markets. The first, and probably most famous, is a Rule 10b-5 action.
Rule 10b-5. Heard of it. What does it cover?
It's extremely broad. It can arise from the fraudulent purchase or sale of any stock or other security that includes bonds, stock options, warrants, you name it. It applies to both public and private companies. Now, for a private person to win a lawsuit under Rule 10b-5, they have to prove several specific elements.
Okay, what are the elements? This sounds like something you definitely see on the bar.
Absolutely. The plaintiff must show: 1, they actually purchased or sold a security. 2, the transaction involved the use of interstate commerce, which is very broadly interpreted today. Using a phone or the mail usually suffices. 3, the defendant engaged in fraudulent or deceptive conduct. This is the core, a material misrepresentation, or, importantly, an omission of failure to disclose when there was a duty to disclose. 4, the conduct related to material information, meaning something a reasonable investor would consider important in making their investment decision. 5, the defendant acted with scienter.
Scienter, what's that?
It means intent to deceive, manipulate, or defraud, or, in most courts, acting with extreme recklessness regarding the truth. Simple negligence isn't enough for 10b-5 liability. 6, the plaintiff justifiably relied on the defendant's fraudulent conduct. And 7, the plaintiff suffered harm, usually financial loss, directly because of that conduct, what we call loss causation. It's a high bar, designed to catch intentional securities fraud, not just transactions that turned out badly.
That does sound like a lot to prove. Intent, materiality, reliance. What about situations where corporate insiders, directors, officers make a quick profit just by buying and selling their company's stock based on information they have? Is there a specific rule against that kind of quick turnaround, even if proving fraud under 10b-5 might be hard?
Yes, there is. That's where Section 16b, the Securities Exchange Act, comes in. This rule is specifically designed to prevent short-swing profits by corporate insiders, and importantly, it does not require proof of fraud or intent or even the use of inside information.
Short swing profits. Okay, define that in insiders.
Corporate insiders, for Section 16b purposes, are very clearly defined: directors, officers, and any shareholder who beneficially owns more than 10% of any class of the corporation's stock. Short swing profits are defined purely by timing. Any profit realized by such an insider from any purchase and sale, or sale and purchase, of the company's stock within any period of less than 6 months.
So buy low, sell high within 6 months, and you're an insider. That profit has to be returned.
Exactly. The profit has to be disgorged, returned to the corporation. It's a strict liability rule. The insider's reason for the trades doesn't matter. Their good faith doesn't matter. Whether they actually used inside information doesn't matter. If you're an insider and you match a purchase and sale in either order within a 6-month window for a profit, the corporation, or a shareholder suing derivatively on its behalf, can recover that profit.
Does this strict rule apply to every corporation, no matter how small or private?
No, it's limited to insiders of reporting companies under the 34 Act. Generally, these are corporations that have either securities traded on a national securities exchange, like the NYSE or NASDAQ, or they meet certain size requirements. Specifically, more than $10 million in assets and a class of equity securities held of record by either 2,000 persons or 500 persons who are not accredited investors. So it primarily targets insiders in larger, publicly traded or widely held companies, where the potential for abuse of inside information affecting the public market is greatest. It's a prophylactic rule designed to prevent the possibility of unfair insider trading by taking away the incentive for quick profits.
Okay, so whether through private agreements in close corporations or through powerful federal laws like 10b-5 and 16b, there are definitely rules governing how you can sell your piece of the corporate pie. But understanding these rules about stock and trading is one thing. Who's actually running the show day to day? Once those pieces of the pie are distributed, who's defining the internal roles, making the strategic decisions, and making sure the company actually operates smoothly?
That brings us right to the heart of corporate governance. The guiding documents that establish the internal framework, and then the key players within that framework who actually make decisions and execute the company's vision.
So we know the articles of incorporation get filed with the state to create the corporation. Once that's done, what's the very next step in actually setting up its internal operations and putting some leadership in place?
Immediately following the filing of the articles, there's typically an organizational meeting. This is where the initial foundational actions happen, breathing practical life into the corporate structure beyond just that piece of paper filed with the state.
What happens at this organizational meeting?
Several key things usually occur. Officers are typically appointed, the president, secretary, treasurer. Crucial bylaws are adopted, which we'll talk about in a second. And any initial contracts that the promoter might have made before incorporation are formally reviewed and potentially adopted by the new corporations board. The initial board of directors might also be formally named or elected at this meeting if they weren't already named in the articles, cementing the initial leadership structure.
Okay, you mentioned articles and bylaws. What's the fundamental difference between those two documents, and can they both be changed easily, or are the articles kind of set in stone?
Think of it this way. The Articles of Incorporation are like the corporation's constitution. They are the fundamental governing document filed with the state, establishing the corporation's very existence, its name, its authorized stock, its registered agent, the absolute basics. Because they are this foundational publicly filed document, they're generally harder to amend.
Harder how?
Well, before any stock is issued, it's simpler. The initial directors, or maybe the incorporators if there's no board yet, can usually amend them by a majority vote. But after stock has been issued and the company's up and running with shareholders, it's a much more involved process. Typically, the board of directors must first adopt the proposed amendment, and then it must be submitted to the shareholders for their approval, usually requiring a majority vote of the shares entitled to vote. Once it's approved by both board and shareholders, the formal articles of amendment must then be filed with the state to become legally effective.
Okay, so articles are the Constitution, harder to change. What about the bylaws? How do they fit in?
The bylaws are more like the corporation's internal rulebook or its operational manual. They contain lawful provisions for the day-to-day management of the corporation's business and the regulation of its internal affairs. Think details about meeting procedures, officer duties, voting requirements, things like that. The absolutely crucial point here is that the bylaws must be consistent with the Articles of Incorporation.
And if there's a conflict, say the articles say one thing and the bylaws say something different.
The articles always control. Always. Because they are the superior, foundational, publicly filed document. As for changing the bylaws, they're significantly easier to amend or repeal. Generally, either the board of directors or the shareholders may amend or repeal the bylaws, often by a simple majority vote, though the specifics can be set in the articles or bylaws themselves. This allows for more flexibility in adjusting internal operating procedures without having to go through the whole formal state filing process required for amending the articles. So you see, these two documents work together. The articles are the bedrock, the Constitution. The bylaws are the more detailed, flexible rulebook built on that foundation. They lay out the structure, which then dictates how authority and power flow typically from the shareholders who elect the board, to the board which oversees management and appoints officers, and then to the officers who manage the day-to-day. Understanding this hierarchy established by these documents is absolutely key to understanding corporate governance.
Okay, so the articles and bylaws establish the internal rules of the road. Knowing that, who are the ultimate power holders in this typical corporate structure? Who really sits at the top of that pyramid you described?
Ultimately, in theory and often in practice, it's the shareholders. Think of the general structure, as outlined in many corporate law frameworks, as a clear flow of authority. Shareholders select and have the power to remove the board of directors. The board, in turn, selects and has the power to remove the officers. So while shareholders typically don't involve themselves in the minute-to-minute operations of the company, they are positioned at the top of that internal pyramid of power. They hold the fundamental control through their voting